speaker is Scott Taylor. He will be presenting on highly pathogenic avian influenza, a wildlife pandemic. Scott was a postdoctoral fellow here at the lab and is currently an associate professor at the University of Colorado. And he's the host of a podcast, and for which I'm not sure that he's aware, but his fan club came tonight. So welcome, Scott.
It's a pleasure to be back. I was a postdoc here at the lab for 4 years, from 2012 to 2016, before I moved to Colorado. I did update this because I got promoted, but it's not official, but I'm making it official, so I'm no longer an associate. Which is great, which means now I'm done and I can just focus on the podcast, right? So, so it was lovely that Laura asked me to come back and talk about the topic of one of our early podcast episodes, is highly pathogenic avian influenza. Outside of hosting a podcast, I study birds, which is pretty not surprising. Chickadee, hybridization. I'm the reason that he said redpoll and not common or hoary redpoll, so you're welcome for that. There's a whole episode about why losing a bird off your life list isn't a big deal, so listen to that one too. And we did add Chihuahuan meadowlark, not that you're ever going to see one over here, although people have seen them in Point Pelee, so you never know. Keep an eye out for light-colored looking meadowlarks. Anyways, I'm going to talk about highly pathogenic avian influenza. Who has wondered about this? Some proportion of you, I'm sure. We do have an avian flu expert in the audience, so when I say something incorrect, he can correct me. But what I wanted to do is just talk about, when we recorded this episode with Dr. Nicola Hill for the podcast, I was aware of the virus. I was aware of the impacts it was having on birds, but I wasn't actually really that aware. I work on chickadees. We tend to think that this virus is not that impactful for passerines. It turns out it is to some extent, and we really actually don't understand a lot of what's going on. So we're going to start a few summers ago in the north of Scotland, and in a single summer, 70% of the United Kingdom's breeding adult skuas died. So this is going to be a bit depressing. I'll try to keep it lighthearted. I don't know. It's hard to talk about influenza and be happy about it. But 70% of a breeding population of seabirds is catastrophic. When you think about how infrequently they reproduce, how long they live, they're not supposed to have adult mortality. And so when you lose 70%, it's a huge deal. And they've lost more again this year. So HPAI is still out there. It's still circulating. It's not behaving in a way that flus typically behave. And so for the next 45 minutes or a little less, we'll see. Bird flu is really bad. That's the topic of the podcast episode. And the truth of it is that, yes, it is really bad. It's unprecedented. It's probably the largest outbreak in the history of the planet, as far as we know, in terms of wildlife disease. And I know that sounds crazy, and you're probably thinking, there's got to have been something worse. As far as we know, no. And the number of bird species it infects and kills now, along with mammals, which is the big concern for you and I, is really, really crazy. So for those of you that aren't as familiar with flu as others, obviously it's something we try to avoid. Most flus have 8 pieces of RNA as their genome, single-stranded RNA. There's 2 proteins on the outside of the flu virus, and the crazy thing about flu is that when an individual gets infected by multiple strains, because of the structure of its genome, you can have this thing called reassortment, and then you get a new flu. And if you happen to have a bird flu go into a pig at the same time as a human flu, you end up with something that's really bad for people. So there's sort of 4 kinds of flu. A is really bad. All of the large flu pandemics were influenza A. Flu B is not great, or influenza B is not great. You're going to feel it, but we vaccinate for it. C is typically mild, and D is only really known to infect cows. And we're going to be focusing on influenza A. That's what highly pathogenic avian influenza is. If you've never visualized a flu virus, here is what they look like. They're not this large, but this is helpful for illustrative purposes. It would be hard to breathe that in. So they have the genome is surrounded by the outside membrane of the flu virus. There's typically 8 pieces of RNA that make up that genome. I think for influenza C, it's only 7. And then I'm sure you've heard H1N1. Does anyone remember which outbreak that was? That was like the the pandemic before the COVID pandemic of swine flu. So flus are named H some number, N some number, and with respect to the avian flus, you'll see how many of those there are. So you get reassortment of these proteins that coat the outside of the flu virus, and that's how we name them. So, so there's the H comes from hematoagglutinin, and the N comes from neuraminidase, and then there's, like I said, 8 pieces to the genome. So these 8 pieces of the genome can reassort, and the surface proteins H and N are where we name flus from. For the bird flus or influenza A's, there's 16 versions of H, 9 of N, so you can end up with 144 possible combinations. And that's why all these flus often feel like some form of alphabet soup. And it gets even worse than that when you have a specific lineage of a specific H number, N number combo, which is what we have now with highly pathogenic avian influenza. Now, most of the time, flu doesn't necessarily evolve really, really fast. I mean, it does evolve relatively quickly compared to other things, like our own genomes accumulate mutations at a much slower rate than typical flu viruses. But over time, mutations can accumulate in the flu genome, and we can track that by paying attention to what are the circulating flus in a given year, and we can look at how they're likely to evolve over time, and that's how we predict what kind of flu virus to generate when we were doing that, which now seems like hopefully somebody's still paying attention to making vaccines. Anyways, I'll try not to get political. I did just become American, so now at least I get to vote. I'm still Canadian though, so that's good too. Anyways, I have an out when I really need it, I guess, but I'm harder to deport now, so that's great. So these small accumulations are normal. Small mutations accumulate over time, and it's why we get a new flu shot variety every year. The big problem happens when you get a big reassortment, and this is how pandemics happen. So when you have multiply infected, the most recent flu pandemic, which was in like 2009, was linked to reassortment in a pig. That's why it was called the swine flu. There's no direct evidence that the other 3 major flu pandemics in the last 100 years were definitely reassorted in a pig, but it seems likely. When that happens, it's not good, because basically you can have both. The thing about pigs in general is that they're a good host for both avian flus and human flus, and then when you get reassortment, you get this relatively deadly flu virus that should only be transmitting between birds, jumping into people via the pig route is one way anyways. And if you look back at the century of pandemics, every pandemic level flu that we've experienced over the last relatively recent human history had bird flu in it. So that's important to think about in the context of the currently circulating highly pathogenic avian influenza, which, as we'll get to, is endemic in dairy cattle now, in only the United States, which is really interesting to think about. It's not endemic in cattle in Europe as far as people can tell, and we can talk about that later. So the last 100 years, there's been 4 main flu pandemics. Obviously, I'm not talking about COVID tonight, but that was also a pandemic. Anyways, 1918 H1N1 was the Spanish flu. It killed between 50 and 100 million people. 1957 was H2N2, or the Asian flu outbreak, which killed about 1.1 million. More recently, in 68, was the Hong Kong flu outbreak of H3N2, which was about 1 million. And then the one that I experienced when I was in graduate school, H1N1, or the swine flu pandemic, had a much lower mortality rate, but we still remember it, right? We were getting vaccinated. There was concerns about elevated mortality from that flu virus. And that was definitely 4-way reassortment from pigs and humans and birds, and then all in a pig again, and then out into the population. So I've already alluded to this, but pigs matter as a mixing vessel. And again, we don't have direct evidence that 1918, 57, or 68 were definitely related to reassortment in pigs, but it's possible. The thing about pig respiratory cells is that they have receptors that work both for the bird flus and the human flus, which means they can be this place wherein if you get multiply infected pigs that are interacting closely with poultry as well as humans, you might get something coming out of that is really not great for people. In the context of the HPAI, which we've been thinking about kind of since 2020, 2021 in terms of circulating broadly in wild bird populations, the ancestor of this traces back to 1996. And so almost everything that we've heard about with respect to bird flu in the last 30 years comes from, as far as the genetics and the tracing says, one farm in the southeast of China. And so the thing about this that was weird was that it killed nearly every chicken that it infected. So typical flus are not that deadly, but this one emerged and was quite deadly and concerningly deadly. And so it emerged, like I said, in 1996. In 1997, there was an outbreak in Hong Kong where 18 people were infected, 6 died, and they killed 1.5 million chickens, which we've all gotten kind of used to hearing about the culling of poultry, right? It feels sort of like, of course, they just did that last week. But at this point in time, that kind of widespread culling to control a flu was really unheard of. And it seemed like, this was the first time anyone had seen H5N1 jump to humans, and the broad circulating lineage that we're dealing with right now is a relative of this H5N1. And like I said, this kind of cull, 1.5 million birds, was kind of unfathomable at the time. We've just kind of gotten used to it because that's how we try to deal with this stupid virus. And at that point in time, it seemed like it worked. But the virus kept popping up here and there over time, and between 2003 and 2024, the case fatality rate, when it does jump into humans, is like 50%-ish. And again, it's probably underreported in terms of how many people it's actually infected, so it could be a lower fatality rate, but it's still pretty high when you think about flu viruses and their likelihood to kill you. So when it has put someone in the hospital and we know that person has H5N1, half of those individuals have died. So it's always been concerning from a human perspective, right? We've always been worried about H5N1, and thankfully there's no evidence it's ever jumped from a person to another person. That's when that would cause a pandemic. Although we're good at making flu vaccines as long as we continue to try to make vaccines. From the wildlife perspective, though, 2020 was not a great year for a lot of reasons, but also not from the perspective of this H5N1 family tree of flus. In 2020, something happened where prior to 2020, this virus was killing chickens and ducks and things like that on farms. But it wasn't showing up broadly in wildlife, and it wasn't killing a lot of wildlife. But that changed about 6 years ago. And so this is the kind of evolutionary lineage of H5N1. So pre-1996, then you have the ancestor of the dominant strain. So this clade 2344B, that's the one that is really problematic, that has continuously circulated the planet since 2021, basically. There's been no letting up, really, of, usually we see flu season, right? And typically even in birds, when we would see other flu viruses, they would appear, they would subside. This clade 2344B has been the dominant H5N1 on the planet. It's the one that's taking out wild birds in numbers that we've never really seen before, and it's still out there. And so this was a reassortment between H5N8 and other avian flus. And so by 2021, just a year after it kind of appeared, it was the dominant version of H5N1 on the planet, and it, along with some derivatives of that, continue to circulate. And they're almost everywhere. They're not in Australia, but they're basically everywhere else. Okay, so this previous H5N1 lineage was fit in poultry, but it wasn't jumping into the wild bird population. But this new lineage, so the clade, you're not going to remember these numbers, but 2344B is the one that seems to be able to jump into wild bird species, and to the point now where there are some waterfowl species that carry it without dying, which is really, like, that's not good. In terms of it's great that some waterfowl can persist and recover from the infection, but the reality is, what do waterfowl do across the entire planet? They migrate, right? And so these wild bird migration corridors now are transmitting the flu virus to lots of naive populations of birds and other wildlife, including 90 plus species of wild mammals at this point. and having devastating consequences on mammal populations to an extent that I can't even mentally really comprehend. It's really quite crazy. So this is just tracing what happened. So 2020 was when this new lineage was detected in Europe, and we saw broad mortality caused by the lineage in Europe. By 2021, it had appeared in North America. In 2022, it appeared both in South America and kind of Eurasia, or more Asia. And then it wasn't until 2023 that it appeared in Africa. And in 2024, it made its way to Antarctica, where it's having pretty devastating consequences on penguins, as you'd expect, but also really bad consequences on some of the native mammals down there too, which I'll get to later. So this really is unprecedented. For a virus to jump out of poultry into wild birds and then across so many different species of wild birds, across really almost the whole planet, minus Australia for now, is really unprecedented. And I think the thing that's really scary about HPAI is this host range expansion. So it went from infecting poultry and ducks and geese on farms to infecting over 566 wild bird species that we know of, right? We're not everywhere. We're not testing all of these different bird species for this virus, so it's likely that that's an underestimate. And 96 different species of mammals. That's like the jump you really don't want to happen, because we're mammals. And so if this virus replicates well in things like ferrets or other organisms, or mink that we farm, the odds of it then becoming able to transmit to humans and maybe between humans, which is what we really don't want, become higher. And so roughly 60% of this collection of birds and mammals across the whole world, including polar bears, which have been testing positive for HPAI, 60% of them had never been recorded as infected with this kind of flu before. So it is pretty catastrophic when you think about it. Sorry, I'm usually funny, but I don't know how to be funny about this. Well, that's not the point. Here to information share. Okay, so the wild bird catastrophe. Here's the dead common eider just to highlight this. It's really hard to count how many birds have died. Has anyone ever seen a dead bird they suspected might be? I don't know what the reports have been in like Tompkins County, but I'm sure it's here. Yeah, so there are, in Colorado now, there's plenty of reports of dead geese. Those are easy to see. Dead ducks, they're easy to see. Has anyone actually ever found a dead warbler in the woods? It's pretty rare. When a chickadee dies in the woods, it's gone pretty fast. So if you think about like our ability to count dead wild birds, we're pretty good at counting live ones, right? We have eBird, we have Merlin to know what we're listening to or whatever, but counting dead birds accurately is really difficult. So this estimate is kind of stupid, but it's definitely more than 1 million, but it could be over 10 million birds since 2021 dying from this strain. And again, this is a paper by Nicola Hill, who was the guest we had on the podcast to talk about the impacts of bird flu on wild birds. And, there are many places where humans are not hanging out a lot of the time. There are many places where birds would disappear quickly. And so these estimates of the actual toll this is taking are really, really hard to calculate. And I think when we can be most confident is when we see 70% of a school colony die in one season, or half of the Bass Rock. Has anyone ever been to Bass Rock to see the gannet colony? I think more than half of them are gone. It's pretty catastrophic. So here are some more numbers just of these mass mortality events, because those are the ones that we typically can see or document. And so between 2021 and 2022, 25,000 UK barnacle geese died in a single winter. Relatively easy to monitor because they're in one place. You see that mortality event. So that's about a third of all of Britain's barnacle geese. In whatever year this was, 2022, 40% of the world's Dalmatian pelicans died in Greece. And so especially during overwintering period, when birds are in more dense populations, you see these larger mortality events. It's either if they nest colonially and then the virus can spread very easily between neighboring individuals, or during the wintering period when they're in larger foraging or feeding flocks, like was the case for these Dalmatian pelicans. This is definitely an underestimate. So I think way back, I think I gave a Cayuga Bird Club talk about my fieldwork in Peru and Chile. I don't know if any of you were here back then, but Those bird colonies are the densest seabird colonies on the planet, like hundreds of thousands of pairs of birds, millions of birds. This is definitely an underestimate, but when highly pathogenic avian influenza hit South America in 2022 to 2023, hundreds of thousands of these seabirds, like guan-eyed cormorants, Peruvian pelicans, and Peruvian boobies, died because of this. And this is ongoing and has spread to the marine mammal populations in Peru. And I was just talking to my colleague down there, Carlos. We have an upcoming episode of the podcast called Okay, but Boobies, because boobies are cool. And he was telling me just about the impacts that flu is having on some of those seabird colonies. They're really not recovering, and then they're about to get hit by a very severe El Nino. So, if you combine the impacts of this unprecedented flu virus with all the other shit that's hitting the fan with respect to our natural world, it's really hard to see how recovery might actually happen for some of these populations that have slow reproduction, which is true for most seabirds. Eurasian cranes in 2000, this was 2025, so really recently, 18,000 or more dead in one place. Cranes are another species that, how many chicks does a typical crane have? Like 1 to 2 if you're lucky. And they don't even reproduce every year. So for these birds that have evolved to live a very long time, have very low adult mortality, and only reproduce a little bit every year, losing this percentage of adults from the population is catastrophic. And then here, just to remind you, this UK Great School of Breeding Adults, this was in 2022 that 70% of the population died. There's more evidence of mortality already this year in the same colonies. So, again, just to highlight why this is important, particularly for seabirds, great schoolers don't start breeding until they're over 7 years old. Some albatross wait 10 years. Who's the most famous albatross on the planet? Wisdom. Yes, Wisdom. How old is Wisdom? 75. She was banded as a reproductive adult. She's the oldest wild banded bird on planet Earth. She's a Laysan albatross, and she's at least 75. And she has an egg once every 2 years or so. She gives me hope because all of the things that are coming at our natural world, and specifically for albatross, things like longline fishing and other fishing practices and plastic ingestion and all the things, she persists. And I think about her. When I start teaching ornithology and it gets sad, I tell everyone, well, Wisdom is still with us. She just got back, because usually when I start teaching the class, she's arriving on the breeding colony. But Wisdom and all albatross species have evolved this slow life cycle where they live a very, very long time. We probably don't even know how old albatross can actually live because we haven't been monitoring them long enough to know, which is pretty humbling to realize. But if you're losing these birds that don't start breeding until 10 plus years of age, that only lay one egg a year, often they take a year off, then losing these huge proportions of the population has consequences that we actually don't understand. We've never experienced or witnessed these kinds of losses for some of these bird species. And so we don't know, if you take 70% of the breeding adults out of a population, it's not going to bounce back in 5 years. You're not even going to have new reproductive individuals in 5 years. It may take many decades before things recover if they don't get hit again and again by this virus or other things. This next slide has a lot on it, but that's all right. This is in the United States alone. So in the United States, 170 wild bird species covering almost every order that you can find on the continent have been found to be infected by and die from highly pathogenic avian influenza. As you might expect, there are many ducks on this list: mallards, pintails, widgeons, snow geese, Canada geese, tundra swans, etc. Lots of gulls, terns, and shorebirds, so herring gulls, Caspian terns, and so on. Lots of hawks and eagles and vultures have been found to die from HPAI. Owls as well, pelicaniformes, suliformes, really any of the groups. I'm going to focus more into the songbirds because we kind of have been taught to think about the songbirds as resilient to this virus, but some of them really are not. Falcons, speaking to the Merlin monitoring, all of them have been detected as having HPAI or dying from it. Galliformes as well, and so on. And then there's like this, we're going to focus back to the condors in a bit because that's one of the success stories with avian flu that actually gives me a little bit of hope. But lots and lots of different species infected, and within these groups of birds, most of them we've seen evidence of. And again, this is just as good as our ability to monitor populations. Not everyone is going out and monitoring bird populations or finding these dead birds, telling someone that could test them about them. And so I would suspect that this is an underestimate. One of the nice things that Nicola told me when we were talking about avian flu is this number is not really going up. Over the past few years, we haven't seen evidence that more than this set of species is being infected at high rates, at least. So that's good. It doesn't seem like the host space for this virus is growing as fast as it initially did. So that's a reason to hope. But this is 17% of US biodiversity of birds. So it's a huge proportion of the total number of birds you can find in North America and Canada. And these, again, are approximate detections. What time is it? I want to make sure. Yeah, okay. We'll see how long this goes. Okay, so zooming in on the songbirds. The songbirds are the birds we see most often. They're the birds in our yards. So far, about 22 species from the order Passeriformes have been found to be infected by and die from this highly pathogenic avian influenza. Most seem to be more resistant than other groups of birds and considered low risk. But the corvids just never are, right? Do you remember when West Nile came through the area? Huge population declines of crows and ravens and other corvids. That's still happening in Colorado and here even in New York, we're filming a podcast episode with Andrea Townsend, who was a graduate student here a long time ago, and she's finding her crows are still dying from West Nile, and now also this highly pathogenic avian influenza. So why do we care about passerines? How many of the world's bird species are passerines? About half. About 65, depending on what you define as a species, right? And I like to play around with that. But of the 11,000-ish birds on the planet, or probably 11,500, it just depends. You have to go to Birds of the World and see what they say today. About 6,500 are passerines. And so over half of all living birds are this group of birds that we don't fully understand their resilience to this virus, but we know at least the corvids experience infection and death from it more than other groups within this order. So from a corvid perspective, we see this virus in American crows, common ravens, blue jays, black-billed magpies, and they do seem disproportionately hit. Now this is a bit of a problem for corvids in the sense that they're typically longer lived than a lot of other passerines, and they have sort of the slower lifestyle. It's not at the scale of like a seabird, but corvids live in family groups. They learn migration routes, they learn behaviors, they live in these social dynamic groups that if you lose a lot of adults in a given year, you could imagine that will have a huge impact on their ability to persist in an area. And we don't understand, I think the takeaway from this is we don't know how to predict what's gonna happen or what the future is for a lot of these groups of birds. Starlings and sparrows, they feed at feedlots. This is likely how cows got infected. Most passerines don't carry really high loads of this virus, but when you have a flock of lots and lots of starlings, even if they're all carrying only a low load of the virus, it could end up being enough to infect cattle, which is kind of one way that folks think that the dairy industry has been impacted, and that's how cattle got the virus. Blackbirds, so the red-winged blackbirds, common grackles, and so on, have all been detected. And again, thinking about the ability for these groups of birds to spread the virus among themselves, they exist in these really large flocks. And if they're infected at the time of year where they're flocking and roosting together, the virus might transmit better. In terms of the other songbirds, which is most of them, the virus has been infected in birds you might expect us to actually notice, right? If a cardinal or a chickadee or a robin or any form of finch that comes to your feeders dies in your yard, you're likely to report it. And so then we would take a sample from that and figure out yes, this does have highly pathogenic avian influenza. But there's lots of birds that don't spend so much time around our houses, right? So we're much less likely to know if this is widespread in wood warblers, for example, which some of them will come to feeders, but it's kind of rare. So the songbirds matter for that reason. They live with us. They're coming to our feeders, they're nesting in our eaves or in our barns. They're the closest avian contact many of us have. They're also, like I talked about with these sparrows and starlings, they move freely between wild places and human-modified places and interact closely with poultry barns where there's extra food, where these really large farms where there's, and we'll get to this, the virulence of this virus is a product of farming practices, not because of wild birds. We can talk about that more, but that's how it can jump into the wild populations potentially. And I already talked about this as well, excuse me, but corvid losses, it's not just population numbers. For a lot of these birds, they have complex social structures that we still don't fully understand. So predicting the consequences of losing these family groups and learned migration routes or seasonal movements, if you don't want to call it migration with crows, what impact is that going to have? There's really no way to know unless we study it a lot more. And again, the reason I think we see this pattern of the other songbirds that we know of flu infecting and killing is this last one, that if a bird dies in our yard, and I encourage you, if you do find dead birds, I don't know, I didn't look into Tompkins County reporting, but I'm sure it exists. You can also report on iNaturalist now if you find at least that you've found dead waterfowl. Don't interact with it, but you can report that it's there. And various state agencies in Colorado, I would report this to Colorado Parks and Wildlife. They would come and they would test that bird to see, yes, either it is infected with the flu virus or no, this is something else. And so a lot of places are asking homeowners to report, especially if you see something in your yard. Okay, so this is the piece that, I mean, obviously that's all very depressing and we're losing a lot of birds. The fact that this flu has jumped into mammals so successfully is really, really kind of crazy when you think about historical flu viruses and how they don't really move so much between birds and so many species of mammals. And so I'm going to run through kind of where we've seen the flu jump and where it most recently got to, which last year was reported for the first time in a sheep in Britain. So all through the wild and then back into a new livestock population, which is probably not great. So it's been, of mammals confirmed positive for HPAI since between 2022 and 25, there's over 90 species. The first ones were things like red foxes, skunks, and otters and raccoons, then mountain lions. So we've seen this in Colorado, and I guess there's mountain lions confirmed in Minnesota now, so they're coming back. Just buckle up, they'll be here, and then they'll eat all your deer, and then you won't get ticks, and that's great for all of us, so bring them back, I say. Yeah, there's lots of food for mountain lions here. I know Ithaca. But this is also kind of interesting. So for a while in the early 2022, 2023, it was all these terrestrial organisms where you can imagine that these predators were finding dying birds and eating them. And that's probably how they were getting infected by the flu. But how does South American sea lions and elephant seals get infected? Well, they're also colonial and they're nesting on the same place. They're not nesting. They're having their young on land surrounded by seabirds that are pooping and dying and spreading the virus. And so the elephant seals, has anyone ever been to South Georgia Island? No? Well, if you ever go to Antarctica, sometimes it's a stop on the way there. Make sure you don't stop in Ushuaia at the dump, I guess. Ugh, that hantavirus thing is terrifying, but I think not as big of a problem as this. There are thousands and thousands of breeding southern elephant seals on South Georgia Island. Half of them died at the end of 2025. Half of the breeding females in one season are gone. Some of these organisms will recover, obviously, and some of them will be resistant, but these losses are really crazy, and it's similar for the South American sea lions. By 2024, it was detected in polar bears, dolphins, and now dairy cattle, which is a huge problem for people and the people that work on dairy farms. It's a great reason not to drink raw milk, and we'll get to that. Well, there's lots of good reasons that pasteurization was... We should do that. Anyways, by 2025, it jumped into a sheep, which is the first time it's ever been reported in a sheep, was 2025. So it's really circulating the globe and circulating through organisms that should not be getting bird flu. So yeah, so this is southern sea lions that we know for sure. I mean, 30,000 plus. How do you actually know? Some of these are dying and floating away, but this is by censusing colonies and looking at what was washing up on the beaches of Peru and Chile. This is how many southern elephant seals died last year. Over the course of less than a month. And it was primarily breeding females. So again, pretty bad. And this isn't what makes the news, right? For some reason, we're worried about egg prices. Ugh. Oh my God. Anyways, that was it. I'm not going to go there. These things are catastrophic. So this was just on South Georgia Island during the last breeding season. Over half of the breeding females died. Okay, and then in 2024, cows are not supposed, well, none of these mammals are supposed to get bird flu. We don't typically see bird flu jumping into mammals in the way that we have. As of 2024, over 1,000 US dairy herds were confirmed positive for highly pathogenic avian influenza across 17 US states. And the point that Nicola made was interesting, is that we're not seeing this pattern in other parts of the world. And so it could be related, at least in part, to our farming practices. This is the part that's just crazy to me. So the udder of a lactating cow has these receptors that look enough like bird receptors that allow replication of this virus. So the udders of these cows is actually like full of flu virus in that milk. Now we're super lucky that we figured out pasteurization, because it inactivates it and you can fully safely drink pasteurized milk. Pasteurization is a really good thing for a lot of reasons, but it does kill the flu virus. But if you drink raw milk that's infected with this, you will probably get infected, and it has a high mortality rate in people. So we are seeing infections in humans who interact closely with dairy cattle, and I'll talk about those in a second. But it's serious, but it's considered now, it's endemic. They don't think there's any way that you're going to get it out of this dairy herd across the United States. So it's there, and thinking about what that means for the evolution of the virus, whether it will jump back into wild birds. Remember, flus reassort, they change, they evolve. That's not going to stop. I mean, they evolve in response to the vaccines we use, in response to the bodies they infect, and they have this really interesting ability to reassort, which means that predicting, I don't think anyone would have predicted the behavior of H5N1 in this, specifically this highly pathogenic lineage. And so, yeah, it's interesting to think about what it could mean for the future. Okay, what about the human cases? Are we okay? Yes, for now, but. So there have been, since February, so this is maybe a little bit out of date, but 71 confirmed human cases and 1 death in Louisiana in January of 2025. 41 of these cases are in dairy workers, typically conjunctivitis. And so you can imagine how, whoops, I got some milk on my face and now it was full of flu and I'm infected. And poultry workers are the second highest case rate of about 24 cases. Thankfully, there have been no human-to-human transmissions of the virus. So it hasn't evolved to replicate super well in the human respiratory tract, and we want that to stay that way, because when it does, that's how a flu starts to be able to be spread very easily within a population of organisms, whether that's humans or birds or other mammals. But there's really, like, depending on who you talk to, there's this one mutation in the H part of the virus that if you mutated, it can flip from bovine to preferring bird receptors to human receptors. So it's not like many mutations off of being able to prefer human receptors, which is problematic. Whether this mutation would happen, who knows? But we're not that many mutations away from the virus potentially being able to replicate well in humans, which is something to consider. Importantly, I think a lot of people who hear about highly pathogenic avian influenza and the fact that it infects wild birds think that the wild birds are where this is coming from. We call it bird flu, and everyone forgets that chickens are birds. When I ask my ornithology class, what's the most numerous bird on the planet? No one ever, well, they're getting wise to it, but most people don't say chickens. There are like 70 billion chickens on planet Earth. But people, when you say bird flu, think about the impact of wild birds on the cost of my eggs or the cost of my chicken or whatever. But high pathogenicity is typically not something that evolves easily in the wild. So a virus needs to get to its next host, right? So if you kill your host too fast before you get transmitted to a new host, you're done. You're not going to be able to replicate. If you do it fast, you have to do it spectacularly, right? Like Ebola, where as you die, you're bleeding out of every orifice, and the likelihood of that virus getting to another human or whatever is high, so then they also die or whatever. But if you're not killing your host in a spectacular way that ensures transmission, then in theory you should have the evolution of lower pathogenicity, right? Which we sort of have seen with the COVID virus, depending on our understanding of the COVID virus, which is still, I don't know, we're still learning a lot. But when you have low costs of high mortality, you can have the evolution of these really virulent strains. And so one point that Nicola made on the podcast, which I encourage you to listen to because it's more fun than I'm being right now, but also really interesting, is that the evolution of this really highly pathogenic strain is the product of the way we farm and the low costs of being virulent in the context of a crowded chicken barn. And then once that jumps out into the wild, you see these costs to things. So if you kill your host too fast, you lose. So viruses tend to become less lethal, which keeps their host alive long enough to spread. Again, unless you're killing your host in a really spectacular way that ensures infection of the next host. But when you have lots and lots of hosts, which also tend to be genetically similar because of just the way we farm, then there isn't a cost necessarily for the lethality of the virus, and you can potentially see the evolution of higher pathogenicity. It's more complicated than that, obviously, but we do raise about 70 billion chickens a year on Earth every year. So at any one time, there's between 20 and 85 billion chickens on planet Earth. They've really done well. If you consider from an evolutionary perspective that you want to be numerous, chickens are doing better than humans. But we need to rethink the ways we farm. I mean, a lot of these viruses that have leaked out of agricultural practices into the wild is in part because of the way that we farm. And so wild birds are not, certainly wild birds are spreading it. Chickens don't migrate. They can barely fly, but they can fly, but not very well because we've made their breast muscles too fat. So it is the wild birds that are spreading this pathogenic influenza across the planet, but it didn't naturally evolve in those populations. It came from farming practices into the wild, spread all over the place, and went kind of nuts. I'm going to end on a positive. So there is more than people are talking about, and I wanted to focus on California condors. And so the California Condor Conservation Program is one of the most expensive conservation programs that the United States has ever embarked on, but it has been a success. And so the global population in the 1980s was around 22 individuals. After 40 years of recovery, we were at 500. And you know we have to catch most of these condors every year and chelate their blood for lead because they're still getting lead poisoning. And if we don't do that, they'll definitely go extinct. So we already have to catch them to get rid of the lead in their blood. But when we do that, we can also vaccinate them for highly pathogenic avian influenza. That has now been done for almost every wild condor. Now think of this. If we hadn't done this, condors would probably be extinct by 2026. But this was a success. They are not. They are generally vaccinated. This is, as far as the condor people are concerned, the first time that we've really used a flu vaccine to protect a wild population from a pandemic, and it seems to have worked. We can't do this with most species of bird, right? We kind of know where every condor is because we've invested bajillions of dollars in making sure there are condors. It's harder to do at large scale, but people are researching like different ways to administer vaccines, and we need to keep investing in that because there is the possibility that we could widespread vaccinate wild birds and potentially save them. But at least in the case of the condors, that seems to be what we've been able to do. So we're not powerless. We can maybe provide a working model for other species that nest in dense colonies or that we're particularly concerned for, like albatross with declining population numbers. We can get to them. We could potentially vaccinate them when they're on their breeding grounds. And other birds that live in these dense aggregations. It's less likely that we'll be able to do this for wild free-living, chickadees or something like that. We're tracking what's going on with the virus in real time. We're seeing it mutate, and so that's, at least we have that tracking going on. There is this vaccine bank now ready to go. If we can figure out ways to, at scale, vaccinate other populations of wild birds, we can do that. So you might have wondered, like, what are birds in zoos doing? zoos are vaccinating most of their collections, because if they don't, they will lose some of them. So I know the Denver Zoo's flamingos are fully vaccinated for flu. So we can do this with other species. And it is really important, like, to the point that it's hard to understand the degree to which this pandemic is impacting birds. We need to be paying attention. And so a lot of our understanding of the breadth and the magnitude of this really unprecedented wildlife outbreak is because people have been documenting what they've been seeing. And so you can more accurately estimate the impact that this is having on wild populations by reporting to places like iNaturalist, but also local state agencies and those sorts of things. It actually does matter a lot. I mean, Nicola has the dead bird report that her lab collects reports of dead birds and amasses this database. So we really have a better understanding of what's going on. Okay, we end every episode of the podcast with a dinosaur nugget because birds are dinosaurs. If you did not know, there's a whole episode on the fact that that's not a lie. And I like snacking. So I thought it would be fun to just do that and maybe lighten the mood, but I don't know. The first reported flu pandemic that we can confidently identify as influenza was in 1580. There were pandemics before that, or there were flus before that, and there were other names for flus. But this was the first pandemic level, and they blamed this on the alignment of the planets and called it the influence, which is in Italian, l'influenza of the stars. And so that's a really beautiful route to a name for something that's terrifying that we have now been worrying about for 446 years. So bird flu is really bad, but we're also really paying attention. There are hopeful stories. We don't know what the next stage of this pandemic is going to be, but it hasn't really let up since it showed its face in 2021. And so we'll see what happens. But thanks. I don't know. This is like the most depressing topic I've ever given a talk about. Thanks for inviting me.
Be happy to take questions.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, in the back.
Any work being done, such as like with the rabies vaccine, they can drop baits for like raccoons and things that spread rabies easily.
Yeah.
Is there anything for seabird populations that's like that in the works?
The great thing about rabies is that rabies doesn't really evolve. It does. It's a thing that can evolve, but rabies is a really slow evolving virus. So the problem with the flu is that you need to match the circulating strain. And so that, and also the delivery, you can eat a rabies vaccine, and that's what we do. We drop pellets for raccoons and skunks and stuff, and it's been really effective at controlling the rabies outbreaks that occur. But it's the delivery mechanism that we haven't figured out necessarily at scale for birds. They were injecting all of these condors. There is like the up the nose option, but again, you've got to get your hands on all the birds. So yeah.
So what about humans? Like, are they developing vaccines for humans yet?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
But not available.
I don't think so. Well, it hasn't it's not transmitting between people, so I don't know. I don't know that they're like preemptively vaccinating.
Wait, you know, or you just wait till people start dropping dead.
I mean, yeah.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, repeat the question. Okay, so the first question was, is there a way to administer the vaccine to seabirds at scale like you can for rabies? But rabies is a really slow evolving virus, so it's easier to administer, plus you can eat the rabies vaccine and then become immune. For birds, the delivery mechanism is different. The second question was, are we just going to wait? Like, are they vaccinating people for this? No, they're not. It's not moving between people. I don't actually know if they're developing vaccines for people who work at dairy farms or poultry farms, but I would assume they are. Tone is nodding his head.
In Finland, for example, poultry workers are vaccinated against the current strain.
Okay. So Scandinavia, not surprisingly, is doing something good for their people. So that's great. Do I think that's going to happen in the United States? No, I don't. Well, okay, let's just, we're going to stay away from what a piece, no, we're good. Another question. Yes, here, in the middle. Yeah, John.
Thank you. If I may pat myself on the back, the California Condor project that is inoculating condors is the Peregrine Fund California Condor Reintroduction Project in northern Arizona and southern Utah, which is a spin-off of something started by Tom Kay here in Ithaca.
Amazing. Yeah. No, that's great. I'll repeat it once I'll tell everyone. Yeah.
The director of that project, and my arm is really getting twisted here, is a former student of mine, Tim Howe. Because the California condors are under the control or direction of the Peregrine Fund, are recaptured and chelated. They are not considered part of the Endangered Species Act because they're manipulated.
Wow. I'm not going to be able to repeat this entire thing. So maybe if you want, so basically you're saying, so the California condor reintroduction and protection is run by one of your former students, is that?
It's run by the Peregrine Fund.
Yeah, the Peregrine Fund.
The former student.
Okay.
And only the portion of the project that the Peregrine Fund supervises is not part of the Endangered Species Act, and those birds can be recaptured and manipulated and vaccinated. And the 3 other reintroduction sites don't have that option because those species are under the full protection of the Endangered Species Act, which means they can't be recaptured and vaccinated, which is a conundrum that you can debate. But it is only the Peregrine Fund supervised portion that is routinely recaptured and chelated and now receiving the vaccination.
Okay. Do people want me to repeat that? Yes. No? Okay. Basically, the Peregrine Fund that is responsible for condor conservation, but only a certain part of the population, those are the ones that are captured, chelated, and have been vaccinated. Although I think more broadly they are adopting vaccinations if they can for wild birds, but I don't know exactly. So I'm going to go to another question, but happy to talk about that more after. Yep.
What's the mortality in dairy cattle?
There doesn't seem to be very much. Like, they seem to tolerate it. It's mostly replicating, as far as I understand it, it's replicating successfully, but there isn't like huge mortality events that I've heard of.
Not directly, but they are culled quite often because they don't produce very well.
Okay, so when they're infected, their milk production goes down and then they're killed. So, yeah, but they don't seem to be dying directly from the virus, which I think if they were, then we would maybe pay more attention. I don't know. It's funny that the thing that motivates that is money, but yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Laura?
So Scott, one of the questions a lot of people are asking is, should we stop feeding birds in our backyard?
Yeah. So yeah, the question is, should we stop feeding birds in our backyards? And I would say no. You know, I think the thing that I loved, we did an episode with Olivia Sanderfoot, the new director of Project Feeder Watch. And she talked about the fact that we feed birds for us, not for them. And when you invite your friends over for dinner, you don't serve them on a dirty plate or put that plate in a room with a lion. So keep your cats inside, obviously. And if you are feeding the birds, I really despise outdoor cats. If you are feeding the birds, make sure that your bird feeder is regularly cleaned. From a flu transmission perspective, it's often between individuals that are in close proximity. So, you know, if there are elevated flu reports in an area, you could consider taking your feeders down. The recommendation right now is for a couple weeks, but there's no actual hard data to suggest that that's the right amount of time. And if only one, anyways, you could inadvertently put a lot of birds at one feeder if one person forgets to take theirs down. Anyways, it doesn't seem like it's a reason to stop feeding birds, but you should always be keeping your bird feeders clean because there's other things like mycoplasma, eye disease, that house finches that Andre Dant studied here for many years. So there isn't a reason right now to stop feeding them, but you should always keep your feeders clean and use like 10% bleach solution when you clean them. That's the best. Yeah. Yes.
Is there any sign of immunity?
Yeah. So the question is there any sign of immunity in the wild? There is, specifically in waterfowl. That's both good and bad because the waterfowl themselves, like some duck species, can tolerate and clear the virus, but they also transmit it. So there is evolving, we will see immunity evolve. You might expect to see immunity evolve faster in shorter generation time birds, like a lot of the passerines have relatively short generation times. There may not be time for large-scale immunity to evolve in things like albatross or skua. It could go either way. It could be that 30% of the skua population that survived because they had some form of immunity, and now the population will slowly grow with immune individuals. Or it could be that you just knock the population so low that some other stochastic event, like a large El Nino, wipes the rest out. It's hard to know. But some are evolving immunity, yes. Yeah.
If you're reporting a dead bird to iNaturalist,
Mm-hmm.
what data are you actually reporting?
Yeah, I think it's mostly about waterfowl at this point, and just reporting that you found like dead waterfowl. I actually haven't, yeah, exactly. So it's not necessarily definitely highly pathogenic avian influenza, but it's a data point. With Nicola's project, which is, I don't remember exactly what it's called, you can say like where you are, what you suspect. Sometimes you can actually see birds, if they're infected with highly pathogenic avian influenza, they have weird behaviors that are not diagnostic, but at least suspicious for avian flu. And then in theory, you're alerting local authorities and they could go and test the birds. That's kind of the goal, to then confirm like, yes, this is highly pathogenic avian influenza or not. Yeah. Over here, yeah.
So is the genome of the virus stable enough that they've been able to use the same vaccine over the last 5 or so years, or they have to produce new vaccines every year?
Yeah, you have to like basically match the circulating strain as close as you can. Yeah. Do you want to add to that? Or you can tell me and then I'll tell them.
So,
Tone studied a highly pathogenic avian influenza. He should have given this talk, but yes.
vaccine development for mRNA
Mm-hmm.
for H5N1
Mm-hmm.
has been stopped in the United States by the idiot.
Yeah, okay. I'll repeat that, but I'll leave part out.
But in mice, it has been shown to work very well.
Mhm.
It's still continuing in England and other countries in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So the mRNA vaccine has the advantage it can be updated very rapidly when there's a mutation in the genome for the hemagglutinin gene.
Yeah, so basically the development and research on this vaccine in the United States is not going anymore, but it is going other places, so other countries have our backs. But basically the mRNA vaccine is easier to update fast to match the mutations, but you really do need to match, like you've had like kind of a less effective flu vaccine over the course of your life, and it does matter how closely it matches the circulating strain in terms of the severity of symptoms and stuff like that. So they do have to try to stay on top of it, yeah. In the back, yeah.
So is the bird flu is passed from one bird to another through the droppings or just like through respiratory?
It can be shed both ways. So it's likely that mammals on these bird colony islands are getting it from droppings and less likely from direct interactions with birds, but it can also be spread through respiratory spread, just like it spreads between you and I. Yeah, both ways. There's just a lot of the flu virus coming out of both ends, basically. Yeah. Yes, and then over here. Yeah.
Yeah, do you know if they've made any models that would correlate diminished habitat with uptick in virus spreading?
Probably. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, you could model, yeah, like if you have denser overwintering sites or reduced feeding sites, so you have more birds crowding. I'm sure that people have built generalized models of disease spread in those contexts, but this is a little bit outside of my field of research, so I don't know specifically. Yeah. Yep.
So cattle are loaded with this virus in their udders and yet seem unaffected. It's not killing them outright.
Yeah.
And all these sea lions that are getting it from seabird populations, even though they co-evolved these seabird populations, they understand like why it's killing the big mammals on these islands. And I mean, presumably they're just more isolated. They don't have a way to.
Yeah. So the question is, like, cattle seem to be tolerating the virus and it's replicating in them and they're not actually dying, whereas these large sea mammal colonies are getting obliterated. I don't know that it's been long enough to know why. You know, these mammals are really different, and you know, you're talking about ungulates versus carnivores, and it seems like it's killing a lot of different kinds of carnivores, which all of the seals and foxes and all of those are carnivores. So is there evidence? I mean, now it's in these sheep. I think it's been recorded in deer, but I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, one more question and then I'll stop. And then if you have more questions, I'll stay here. Yes.
On the species that are infected, Do they die of a slow suffering type of death?
Yeah, so the question is, how do they die? Is it slow and suffering? And it certainly seems to be that way for a lot of birds. Yes, they have neurological symptoms. Some of them die faster than others, but Nicola describes pretty, and you can look up videos of this. It looks not great. Neurological symptoms, and they can't really fly very well. They have muscular problems. So it's not really fast, typically. But you've seen it. So.
It depends a little bit on which species you're
Yeah,
talking about.
yeah.
Because in some species, the pathogenesis, that's how the disease develops, is different than in other species.
Mm.
And some species can kill birds within 24 hours.
Yeah.
The black swan in Australia is an example of that.
Mm.
It's experimental because it's not in Australia.
Right, yeah. I was like, what? Australia? They're still safe.
Species like wild mallards, the peking ducks, it may take 6-7 days before they die, and the pathogenesis is different in those birds.
Yeah. So what Tone is saying is that it depends on the species. So there are some species like black swans, which have been experimentally infected, die within 24 hours. Other species, it can be days, 6-8 days before they die. So it depends on the species. But with the gannets that Nicola was describing and the common terns, which both have been have died from infection, it takes a number of days, and it's pretty gruesome. Yeah. All right, I'm going to stop taking questions, but I'm going to stay here and answer any that you have as you come up. Thank you for inviting me. Sorry it was depressing. Please listen to the podcast.